Good evening and welcome to Budget 2025 live here on TVS. My name is Rashad Ali and for the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to deep dive into all things budget presented by Prime Minister Dato Sri Anwar Ibrahim earlier in Parliament today. Joining me tonight, I have an esteemed panel of guests. If I may quickly introduce everyone. We have Mr. Libat Langgup, Secretary General of the Dayak Chamber of Commerce and Industry. Mr. Libat, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
We also have Mr. Desmond Anil. Mr. Desmond is the National Council member of the SME Association. Mr. Desmond, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you, Rashad, for having me.
Finally, last but not least, we have with us Dato Richard Wee, President of the Federation of Chinese Associations Sarawak. Glad to have you with us tonight.
Thank you, Rashad.
Thank you, gentlemen. So very quickly to begin, Budget 2025's theme very much seems to be in keeping with the Madani government's vision of raising the floor as well as raising the ceiling, looking at different ways that the government can alleviate the cost of living and help Malaysians across the spectrum. With the theme of reinvigorating the economy, driving reforms, prospering the rakyat, we can really see the Madani government's sort of ambition and initiatives here. There's a lot of continuity that we see from the last budget to this one. Significant increase in the budget overall at 421 billion. It's the largest budget that we have yet. Significant allocations to wealth redistribution and cash transfer as well. Operational expenditure accounting for about 80% of the budget, which is 335 billion. But at the end of the day, what do these numbers mean, right? If I may quote our Prime Minister earlier today, he said, the virtue of wealth is not to have it, but to use it rightly. Now, with the backdrop of a positive economic outlook, and as the Malaysian economy experiences this kind of resurgence, how will this budget translate to the lives of ordinary Malaysians? So perhaps to kick things off, maybe I can quickly invite each of our panel over here to just share very quickly their initial impressions and thoughts. Mr. Libat, if I can start with you.
Okay, although a few of our wish lists are not incorporated in the budget, I see that our Prime Minister, YAB, Dato Sri Anwar, is desirous of seeing that there is rapid growth to be shared equitably by all Malaysians. In other words, we're talking about shared prosperity and inclusiveness. I think this is very important in a country like ours, which is multiracial. But as a Sarawakian, I am happy for a few things. The Cancer Center, which is 1 billion, allocation is 1 billion. Dilapidated schools, and also allocation for SSLR Phase 2, of which runs through the Orang Ulu country, of which I'm from there. So I'm happy about that.
Thank you, Mr. Libat. Definitely some issues that we will come back to later in our program tonight. Mr. Desmond, some of your initial thoughts, please.
Yeah, thank you, Rashad. It's interesting to see the budget 2025, the Madani government disseminated it. It's quite interesting. But as I echo your views, especially the Prime Minister's views, it is specifically for the prosperity of the Rakyat, and also the notion of telling the Rakyat to use the budget wisely for themselves. So what is very important is that to look at the aspect of the budget itself for the Rakyat and how the Rakyat is actually looking into this. But in terms of businesses and SMEs itself, it is quite vague in the aspect of how the budget is been put forth and how is it been actually disseminated for businesses and the growth of businesses. It is not clearly seen, but yet I suppose there is a lot of proper tax incentives and grants given to the PKMS and also the SMEs.
Excellent. Dr. Richard, some of your thoughts, please.
Yeah, I think overall it has been a fairly balanced and also progressive budget. And I think it has covered a lot of areas, which includes the social safety nets and also the social welfare and also the women folks. But all these policies are premised on the effective and efficient implementation on the rolling out of at the various ministry or the agencies. So I'm glad to see that one of the major thrusts of the national budget is to emphasize on the project and service delivery. So as the saying goes, all good policies are just as good as the efficient and effective delivery. I'm just looking forward to that.
Excellent. I think that the mechanisms of policy delivery is definitely going to be a running theme throughout our discussion tonight. So if I can summarize quite briefly some of the things that we're going to touch on, firstly look at some tax reform, tax introductions in the budget, addressing some labor reform, quickly looking at subsidy rationalization as well, potentially green initiatives and energy transition, rural developments and social safety nets, and what allocations we have for investing in the future. So I thought to start things off, we'll go to something that there was a lot of speculation prior to the budget coming out today about what sort of new tax we would see. So I think there was this urgent need for the government to increase its tax revenue, which led to a lot of speculation about the introduction of all kinds of suggestions, inheritance tax, high-value goods tax, to name a few. In the end, none of which we saw. We saw some progressive changes to the SST, which I think is particularly interesting. Mr. Desmond, I'll invite your thoughts very quickly. So correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of this is basically we're looking at a tax or SST tax on certain premium import items as opposed to basic necessities. Please, if I can get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, generally the SST has been put in place in the form of progressive SST. But generally the food aspect of the SST, especially the sales tax, majority of it is actually on the exemption order. That means it's already been exempted.
Okay.
But what you want to look at is actually the non-exemption ones, in which that would be something that the government will be looking at, and be more specific on it, and most probably the list of what are the goods that is been supposed to be taxed on will be given to us, and eventually we will understand even further. But for now, it's remained to be seen. All right. Further to that, there's also things on the business commercials,
Yes.
aspect of it, the fees for financing and so on.
Yeah.
That should be actually elaborated even further, because we do not know what do you mean by business commercial fees and so on. So that's something that we should be looking at.
Any particular thoughts on why the government has opted for this approach, and considering these progressive changes to the SST, what benefit are we likely to see? Perhaps in the short term?
Generally, it will be difficult to see because it's adding to the cost of doing business. So anything pertaining to tax is almost like to alleviate the price of doing any business. When you look at products and goods, right, and you put a tax on it, obviously you're going to have the inflation on the price of the price that's been paid by the rider, you see. Eventually, this sales and service tax, when it's put into the business, there is a cascading effect as well, which needs to be looked at, and eventually it will rise. You create a cost increase in it, a cost hike in it. So when it comes to SMEs and its businesses and so on, it needs to be looked at, especially the price, the price of the products and so on, and eventually even you talk about services over down there.
Yep.
It's where the government is seeing that we have to go into high value services and also go and do high value automations on manufacturing and also products and so all that. And all that is quite good, but we also would like to see the aspect of the ease of doing business and also attracting better FDIs and so on.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dr. Richard, this kind of hints back at something you just mentioned earlier. What sort of delivery are we going to see? How are we going to manage the implementation of a progressive tax that looks to tax different goods? What do you think are going to be some of the key challenges perhaps that businesses might face in the short term with this potential introduction?
I think by increasing the scope of the SST, that would definitely drive the cost up for the business sectors. I think they will increase the price of the goods, I'm so glad that the other taxes that you mentioned earlier, particularly the inheritance tax, is not being considered or not being proposed. Otherwise, it would be even counterproductive. You know. But I think the scope of increasing the SST will definitely be a major impact onto the cost of doing business in the country.
A lot of commentary pre-budget was looking at potentially the introduction of GST. Now, as we got closer and closer to budget, it appeared less and less likely that GST was going to be introduced. How do you see these changes to the SST relative to gains that we would have got from introducing the GST?
I have a hunch that they will probably try to assimilate as close as possible to the GST structure. And particularly then when they are introducing the e-invoice and all that sort of thing. But hopefully it can be in a form of a GST. I think the GST itself is the most effective type of tax system as many countries have adopted it. The question is the quantum. So I think if they are willing to call it GST, they are willing to increase the scope of SST. If they can try to get the gist of it to be close to the GST kind of structure, that would be just as good.
I think I pretty much like to echo what Dato' Richard had just mentioned. Actually, most SMEs are actually quite supportive of the implementation of GST during the GST era, and even now they were looking forward towards the GST. But of course, it is something that is on the business side, you know. But the introduction of e-invoicing and all that, these are things that is aspect that would actually enhance on the area of GST. It can be the case that even when you look at the scope of SST in the future, probably there can be elements that is put in which emulate the GST aspect. Yeah.
Of course, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim said earlier this week that we are unlikely to see the reintroduction of GST until the minimum wage goes up, which is something that we will be discussing at a later point of today's segment. Before we get to that, though, there's another thing that I want to talk about, which is the 2% tax on dividends. Yes, Mr. Desmond, earlier in our pre-discussion, before we went live, we had a lot to talk about over there. So maybe you can share some of your initial thoughts. Then I'll invite everybody also to jump on.
It is quite a surprising aspect of this particular tax. We were not expecting this particular tax to come and surface. All right, so there is this aspect whereby there's a threshold for it, anything above 100,000. And there'll be a 2% on the chargeable income for chargeable dividend income.
Yes.
All right, to be a bit more specific there.
And of course, there are exceptions for KWSP, ASP.
Yeah, so those individuals that actually receives dividend from this, they are exempted from this particular, taxes. But in general, would it be the aspect whereby now, when you have foreign companies coming into Malaysia and now merging, where there is technology transfers, there is mergers and acquisitions, there is, we're talking about incentives flowing into the country by having, by virtue of the MIDA agencies or other promotional items which actually goes and, try to get in touch with SMEs in Malaysia. Would it now curb this, Right, this remains to be seen, because when you put such a tax, and it's a tax on tax probably, or even specifically the income of dividends now has been taxed at 2%, would it be very attractive for foreign investors to come into the country? It remains to be seen. Further to that, you also have SMEs over down here who wants to expand in the area of AI, and in the area of automation, which picks up collaborations with overseas parties. Now, when you have such a tax on dividends, would this be something that you will, suppress the growth and knowledge of these SMEs, especially on the area of green technology, because we are adopting a lot of these things not on our own.
Yes.
We're also bringing sustainability and sustainable green technologies and renewable technologies from overseas. Data centers have been coming into here. So these are all things that even SMEs are also collaborating and starting to do some of these jobs. So when you have such a tax, would it be an effect? Does it have an effect on it? Yeah.
Yes, and knowledge transfer is, of course, a critical component of attracting FDI. It's something that we definitely do not see as much as we should here in Malaysia. Right. Dr. Richard, anything that you would like to add on this new introduction?
My personal reading of this 2%, I think it needs a lot of further clarification. But if I read it the way I saw the announcement, it is actually applicable to individual. They tax you if the individual received the dividend. So I think it needs clarification. I mean, I share what Desmond mentioned, but I think if we can try to get more clarity with regard to how it is going to be taxed, if it's going to be taxed at individual receiving the dividend, then the company's investment may not be affected.
Yeah.
But however, it actually, this kind of tax, I think it will hit the SME more because the SME shareholders are usually individuals. And if they do pay the dividend, then they are being taxed twice. Yeah. So I think it needs further clarification.
Yes, a lot of what we are talking about today is still some of our initial impressions based on the budget speech. We are looking forward to clarifications in Parliament debates to come in the coming weeks. Ladies and gentlemen, we are going to take a short break. We'll be right here on Budget Watch 2025 live on TVS. Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to Budget Watch 2025 live here on TVS. Picking up where we left off, we were still on the subject of taxes. I wanted to talk very briefly about the sugar excise increase to 40 cents a litre starting from January 2025. Now, obviously, Malaysia occupies a position of a lot of terrible stats here, in terms of obesity, in terms of diabetes, and there is definitely a health gain to be got here in the introduction of a sugar excise. And the additional revenue will be used to fund public health care, including increasing the supply of SGLT2 inhibitors for diabetes treatment and expanding dialysis treatment for end-stage kidney disease patients. So definitely some upsides, definitely some positives, but also wanted to very quickly talk about what this is probably going to look like on a day-to-day level, whether for the individual customer or whether for, again, small businesses. A lot of our conversation here tends to be dominated by small businesses right now.
Yeah. So in general, we are looking at a first increase in 2024, which is at 50%,
right.
50 cents per litre, and now an increase for another 40 cents, which is eventually a 90 cents increase in 2 years, right?
That's right.
So anything of pertaining to health and also sugar is obviously well welcomed by, I suppose, by everyone. because I think the obesity level in Malaysia, as how KKM has just announced and so on, it is quite on the high side. So, well, I think the Madani government is also trying to channel this to the welfare of the rakyat as well. So I suppose this would be something very interesting, very good for the country, very good for the rakyat as well. But now we have to look into the SMEs, PKS, whereby they have bazaars, probably the pasar malams, all the small stalls, and even mid-sized SMEs, because when you talk about mid-sized SMEs, whether we have those retailers on food and beverages,
That's right.
right? Will they be affected by this, by the increase of another 40%, and subsequently the increase of costs? It is good, but yet there is an aspect of it, that needs to be assessed. Especially I would be more worried on the aspect of the PKS, the small and medium or micro SMEs. This should be some form of hurting them a little bit for the generation of their own income, or rather a monthly or day-to-day income as well.
Personally, I'm quite curious to see what sort of behavioral change this might cause, whether it will actually move Malaysians away from sugary drinks. I think there is also a distinction between ready-made drinks and those that are prepared on site. So if I'm not mistaken, the previous sugar excise, it was only for ready-made drinks, like canned drinks and things like that. But if it's drinks that are prepared on site, it doesn't necessarily apply. Like when you go to the Mamak, for example, or the limau ice, it doesn't apply to that. So we'll be curious to see how this kind of unfolds in the next couple of weeks or so.
Yeah, but Rashad, I think I have to butt in over down there. Have to disagree a little bit, because there's the aspect on like milkshakes.
Yes.
There's the aspect of those carbonated drinks and those fruit juices as well, which was also looked at like 12 grams and above per 100 ml. And then there's an aspect of the kicking of that exercise, or the 50 cents over down there. So in the aspect of this particular proposal on the 40 cents, they have not mentioned that. Maybe they are just carrying on the same grammage, the same ml, because it's still per liter, right? So they're still following the same type of tabulation. In this case, if they have just increased it by another 40 cents, it's 90 cents with the same table.
Yeah.
That is a
significant
increase for businesses especially. I'm all for sugar taxes, but when it comes to business, I think there's an aspect which we have to take a check and balance over down there.
Personally, I'm all for disagreements on this panel. So if anybody wants, please happily disagree with me. It makes for a more interesting and robust discussion. Just want to move quickly on to tax rebates. Sorry, Desmond, so much of this is directed at you at this point, because this is essentially the tax section of all the things that we want to talk about. So earlier we were talking about tax rebate and expansion for individuals. This I'm sure you elaborate a little bit more on. Can we consider this as a way for the government to alleviate the current cost of living?
Well, but these are tax rebates and relief that's already been present in your taxes. So they have just, I think the government now has looked at it further. As we just mentioned at the first go, that it is specifically for the rakyat. So it's good, because we are looking at healthcare, where your insurance premiums now increases from 3,000 to 4,000.
Yes.
We have medical expense relief now right up to 10,000. So it's some things like this, and even you look at the PRS annuity, which was already expiring, and now they have extended it again. So, but what's more interesting is the housing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Please elaborate.
Yeah, the housing is quite an interesting one, where it's just mentioned for first-time whole house buyers. Okay, let's just look at it. Just excuse me here. Let's look at it. Okay, to encourage the purchase of first residential home among the rakyat, is mentioned, and to increase the disposable income, it is proposed that the individual income tax relief to be given on the interest payments for the first residential home. All right. And in this case, it talks about the tax relief is up to 500,000 of your purchase of your property is about 7,000. So this is something a bit better for first-time home buyers and first-time taxpayers as well. Yeah, and then 500 and above to 750. The cap is 750. You are able to claim up to 5,000 ringgit. So
Yeah.
generally, it's quite an interesting one where they're allowing you to actually find shelter. You know,
I must confess, I quite like this idea a lot for two reasons. One, something that Dr. Richard has drummed into my head at this point, which is the importance of delivery, right? Importance of policy delivery. And I like anything around tax rebate because the delivery mechanisms around that are already in place. There's no issue there as far as anyone is concerned. And also on the tax relief on housing, I think with a cap of 750,000, there's a lot of wiggle room and lots of people will be,
interested.
Exactly, will be interested, will be eligible for this. So now we're going to change tack totally. We are going to move away from tax and go into something I'm sure everybody's going to be very keen to talk about, which is the proposal to increase the minimum wage from 1,500 to 1,700. Now, very quickly, there's also, this proposal also includes a grace period, I believe, for companies with less than 5 employees. So I think if you have less than 5 employees, there's like a 6 months grace period before you need to take up the new wage. Mr. Libat, over to you on some of your initial thoughts on the proposal to increase the minimum wage. How do you feel this is going to impact Malaysian workers and then also potentially the impact on SMEs?
This, I think, is a very, I can say, it depends on who you ask and who you talk to. Of course, we all know that in Malaysia, generally, the wage is generally low, and also increase in wage is also very slow. And but I believe the reason why the government is doing this tax reform and increasing the wages because of the cost of living.
Yes.
This is to alleviate the cost of living. But if you look at it from the employee side, you'll be very happy because you earn a little bit more, and therefore you can spend a little bit more. That, as I said, will alleviate the cost of living. But from the employer, I think there's a little bit of unhappiness there, if I may say, because this will be put into their cost of production. And then it may be counterproductive if you were to talk about trying to alleviate the cost of living. I believe this is a good way of, generally speaking, it's a good way of helping the rakyat to earn a living, because now you have problems with cost of living, a higher price of houses,
Yes.
and what have you got not. So I think, generally speaking, people who are employed are happy with it.
There's this inherent tension that exists, right, between having a wanting to pay workers more and then also the cost of doing business. And we kind of get stuck in this trap of how do we as an economy sort of move up, our scale and stop being stuck in this low wage trap, if you will. So maybe I can also invite anyone else's thoughts on short term. We are talking about impact on SMEs. Is this more beneficial in the long term? Will we get there in the long term?
It's quite interesting to see that the government has actually given some leeway, giving a couple of, was it 6 months, is it?
6 months, I believe, 6 months grace period. Yes.
Grace period of 6 months to see how, probably they want to support businesses and employers to see how they can incorporate this minimum wage. It is also something that, what's positive is to see probably, is to see that when the minimum wage is increased, then the idea is to probably to get businesses to look at high value businesses or high paying businesses,
Yes.
or rather retrain your staff to get to that particular minimum wage, or rather to a certain wage salaries that you're going to be paying them. And employing skilled workers, right, at this level for better businesses. But what is the other aspect of things is that this will be, like how Mr. Libat was mentioning, that it's going to be affecting the cost of doing this. Now, obviously, in the 6 months, whether the employees, especially SMEs, right, SMEs employ on need-based basis, they react to a certain to a certain outcome. So are they going to implement this at the get-go of 1st of January 2025?
Yeah.
Or are they going to progressively implement this, or after 6 months, they start to implement it? Okay? So these are things that is been looked at. And further to that, you also have this cost that's incorporated in all of these products and services that you're offering, you know. So yeah, I think, Mr. Richard, I think do you
Yeah.
see the same thing?
No, I feel that with this 1,007 that is being announced, we just have to use the previous time when they increased it to 1,005 as a sort of a experience example. I think the immediate impact is that you will see that all the companies will be reacting in a sense that they have no choice. But the impact is actually can be quite significant, because once you push up the minimum wage to 1,007, then it pushes up the rest.
Yes.
That goes up.
Yes.
The impact is not just another $200. It actually goes up other scale. The one who is actually
Much more higher
currently
than them,
2,000 has to go up to 2002, 2004,
Right.
and so forth. So I think the impact is actually quite high, quite a high impact for companies. But on the other hand, like what Libat was saying, that the wages for Malaysian employees have always been fairly low, in comparatively speaking, with the regional countries and all that. But the other thing is why are we complaining about the salary being low? It's because the cost of living goes up. Why? Because of goods becomes more expensive. Why? Because our currency is weak. And all that sort of thing contributed to the cost of living is increased. But certainly, if our exchange rate is much favorable, I think the country or the people would have a higher disposable income, and they don't have to complain. I mean, it's like comparing with your 1,005 salary or 1,007 salary here and the 1,007 salary in Singapore. You know, that kind of comparison when you actually take the currency into consideration. But the currency itself is also pushing, being weak is also one of the contributing factor for all the goods that you may be importing, whether what kind of food, stuff, and all that sort of thing. But I think as a whole, it is realistically has to happen, you know. But I think SME would again be the hardest hit, and in this respect. I think even they talk about the grace period, about 6 months, is only given to those who are actually
less than five employees
and below.
Yeah.
The ones that more than 5 employees would be almost immediately.
Yeah.
So I think SME would probably, or the companies who are in that kind of situation, may have to try to think about a different mindset or different mechanism to increase the productivity of the staff, and also they may even cut down the replacement of, if there is a major natural attrition, people retire, you don't re-employ, you know, and then you can try to have their own internal mechanism to try to sort of address this issue.
Perhaps there's no easy time, I guess, to look at increasing the minimum wage. As you mentioned earlier, it's something that definitely needs to be done, but the hard reality is that it will still definitely impact SMEs, businesses. I think hopefully we are also probably looking at the expansion of the progressive wage policy, which was introduced as a voluntary scheme earlier this year. I believe there were also portions of the budget dedicated to the expansion of the progressive wage policy. As a policy nerd myself, I always like to think of things complementary. So if we want to introduce minimum wage, we also want to ensure that there are complementary policies that reduce the impact, especially on SMEs. We're going to leave it there for now. We're going to go to another short break. We'll be right back with more Budget Watch 2025 after this. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Budget Watch 2025. Before we went to break, we were talking about minimum wage, the proposal to raise from 1,005 to 1,007. In our short break, we discovered that we still have more things to talk about over here. I believe that, Dato' Richard, you were talking about certain incentives, if you were.
No, I was just thinking that in order to cushion the SME's burden, if they can, the government can consider or giving higher incentive for retraining of the staff, and then like a human resource fund to be even more aggressively being pursued for the retraining of the staff in order to increase productivity and all that sort of thing. So, and those expenses can be claimable and or tax deductible and all that. It may be able to help cushion the kind of additional costs in being burdened by the companies.
Definitely. And again, going back to complementary policies, this would be a great way to soften the blow a little bit as far as increased cost of business is concerned. I wanted to sort of pivot a little bit to this proposal in the budget about mandatory KWSP contribution from foreign workers.
Just before we go into that, I would still like to echo what Dr. Richard said. The government is also providing some form of incentives and usage of the particular levy to train staffs and so on. So that's something to look at and also to digress with and also to digest as to how this is going to be implemented specifically and how is the business able to claim this from HRD Corp and so on. Further to that, going back to the KWSP for foreign workers, it is made, the suggestion or cadangan they call it, it's specifically mentioned it's supposed to be mandatory for foreign workers with the minimum wage now, mandatory to include statutory employment cost, things like aspects of KWSP, payments by the employer side. So there is also the employee side and also the employer side generally. So now this is also adding to the cost of doing business now. So staff costs are going to be much more higher. Now, I'm not saying this is wrong. Foreign workers should be given that, the aspect of contributing for this and also the aspect of insurances, which has already been put in place. Now, it is a good move by the government. But then again, now, SMEs especially, mid-sized SMEs now will have to look at the overall budget, especially manufacturing firms. They were looking at our overall budget. Is it the case that now SMEs will now move into automation? That's remained to be seen, because it can be the case that you have 2,000 over foreign workers or even, 500 over foreign workers, and now there is an added cost there.
Yes.
So this is something that needs to be to look at,
Yes.
And I would see that in the short term, right, I would see that this would be an effect on the cost of doing business, especially when it comes to SMEs. And you look at in a projection of 1 year, you're talking about labor cost per month, and you talk about 12 months worth of costs. Now that's going to be a bit of a pinch for the SMEs as well.
I feel like a lot of the proposals in the budget are centered around ensuring that it's more inclusive for Malaysian workers, foreign workers as well. And I don't think in principle there's anything that any of us here disagree on. If anything, there is the distance between the current existing business climate and the climate with which businesses start up, and then what are going to be essentially new operational costs, new costs of doing business. So in the weeks to come, I hope that once more attention is paid onto SMEs, we'll be able to shine a little bit more light to understanding how this is going to impact businesses moving forward. So I wanted to talk a little bit, this is kind of in the same ballpark, but not really. One of the things that stood out to me also was proposals around women and returning to work. So there we have one proposal here from the government, an additional 50% tax deduction on wages paid 12 months to employers hiring women returning to work. Earlier today, before we went live, we were talking about how this is definitely something that has a lot of underinvestment, we can say, and it is, to put it in one way, untapped as far as the economic potential is concerned. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit here in terms of making allowances for work-life balance, allowing employees to work from home, making more flexible arrangements, particularly for women to return to work. Dr. Richard, we were talking about this earlier. How do you feel about addressing some of these low-hanging fruit as far as working from home, flexible working arrangements is concerned?
I like the idea of being able to try to tap this kind of potential with all these women who has experience and all that after they have given birth, if they not given the incentive for coming back to work, and then if they are having that sort of incentive now, it will be able to tap that kind of resources, you know. But my issue here is that they say that they will give you a 50% rebate, is it?
50% tax deduction
Tax deduction.
on wages.
Yeah.
Now, I think that is something of which you need to try to have a system to try to how do you evaluate these are the people who are actually coming back to work, or are they? What happens if those who are actually leaving another company and join another company, leaving one company and join another company, would it consider coming back to work? You know, I mean, that's how I mean, you need to have a monitoring system to actually make sure that the kind of incentive is actually being fully utilized and not being abused, you know. So I think all this again comes back to the project and service delivery, and how do you roll out all this kind of incentive that you intend to try to let the industry or the sector benefit.
Of course, we also have the, I believe it's called the talent, I can't remember now.
Talent Corp.
Was it Talent Corp? Yeah.
Yes, the Talent Corp program.
Yeah.
So hopefully, you know, we see an expansion in efforts similar to that again, so that it is.
They're always saying that the devils is in the details.
Exactly. Exactly. Okay, to change tack completely, let's talk a little bit about rural development infrastructure budget. So we have an allocation of 5.9 million for Sarawak and 6.7 million for Sabah. Some of the projects that have been mooted.
Billion. Is it?
Billion.
Million? Did I say million?
Billion.
Billion, sorry.
Billion.
Billion. My notes are wrong. So some of the suggestions that were mooted with 1 billion spent on a cancer center here in Kuching. Allocations for the development of schools in Sabah and Sarawak. So this comes back to something earlier that you were mentioning, Mr. Libat, about dilapidated schools. So I wanted to invite your thoughts on this investment. What does it signal for Sabah? What does it signal for Sarawak? What can we expect, Mr. Libat?
Now this budget seems to just increase the development tax, development expenditures to 5.9.
5.9 billion.
Last year was 5.8. And also, above that, we have this special interim grant of 600 million. For this, I think we say we thank you for the allocation by the PM. First, talking about rural development, I'm from the rural area, and in Sarawak, actually, we have 40% of Sarawak is rural. Some are town rural, some are remote rural. So I'm talking about remote rural. I think it is key factor that infrastructure development in the rural area is key. And more so because now of the digitalization, AI and internet and all that, it is important that some of this money goes to building roads and electricity and water. But of course, the state government and the federal government, the focus of development actually has been on rural, especially our Premier YAB, Tan Sri Abang Jo. He is very committed to develop the rural areas, and I believe he will do that. Talking about areas, for example, like SSLR, that is actually going rural. SSLR 1, SSR 2, the Sabah Sarawak laundering. Substantial amount has been allocated for the SSR 2, which will bring, I'm sure, as a game changer for the rural area. And the other one is the allocation on dilapidated schools. If I'm not mistaken, in July this year, the Minister of Education said that there are about 555 schools in Sarawak which are dilapidated. Some are going to be repaired, and some new building totally altogether. I think education is very important. I think these students are going to be our future leaders, so I think we must be very careful about how we get these students into good schools.
Yes.
So basically what I'm saying is rural development is important, and I believe those development expenditure that we saw just now will go into that.
Thank you. Dr. Richard, what do you think are some of the key priorities for Sarawak in particular?
I think in the budget, I think Sarawak and Sabah have been given the kind of continue to have their fair share of the allocation. And then particularly Sarawak, we have, like I mentioned earlier, the cancer center that has been promised. And the school that has been needed, all this repair, although the state government here, the Sarawak government, has at that in the earlier year, beginning of this year or last year,
June this year,
they said that they have decided that they will use their fund to try to repair all the school first. Waiting for the fund to be then be released by the federal government. I guess this will be the one that they will be paying back the Sarawak government. But you see, it has this far-reaching kind of impact. If you don't have a school that is actually properly, equipped or even dilapidated, the kind of state. You try to transfer the principal or the teachers from wherever they are, going to that kind of school, they will be the first one to say that, I'm not going to stay. I mean, and it's the same thing as why they say that they always have these reasons the teachers from Semenanjung don't want to go to the rural schools and all that. I mean, you put yourself in that shoe. You go to a school where the toilet is rosa and all this sort of thing. I mean, what would your reaction be? So I think the kind of impact is not just the money. It's just also having that kind of
basic necessities.
So I think with this budget, I think all this has been sort of in a way taken care of, and the cancer center that has been promised for so long. And at least we do have a location now. And we feel that at least what has been promised is being fulfilled. And that in that respect, I think we are thankful to the federal government's fulfilling their promises.
Hopefully we can see a nice rebalancing of development between Semenanjung and Borneo, but at the same time allowing Sabah and Sarawak to retain much of their rich cultural heritage, which is very unique to the region.
Just to add to Dr. Richard, I think we're talking about I think in June this year, YAB Premier announced that the state will be allocating 100 million for dilapidated schools and to be paid by the federal government later on. And I think this is under the initial funding initiative. We have that concept here.
Yes. So moving on very quickly, I just wanted to talk a little bit about two things: subsidy rationalization and the STR program, the expansion of the STR program and the allocations. So the allocations have been increased to 30 billion compared to 10 billion previously. This increment is likely to benefit 9 million recipients, or equivalent to about 60% of the country's adult population. Now, on the other hand, when it comes to subsidy rationalization, now this hints back to something that we were talking about earlier in the show and also before we were live on air. We haven't really seen much in the way of new taxes that are being introduced, particularly for higher income brackets. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't some sort of wealth redistribution taking place. So we're looking at subsidy rationalization in things like education, in healthcare. Some of the suggestions by the Prime Minister earlier today included higher income going to public hospitals would have to pay more than what they currently do. Dr. Richard, you were sharing some of your thoughts with me earlier today, if you may.
Yeah, personally, I think that is a fair way of trying to distribute, or who should be paying. Those who are able to should be paying more, and those who are in need of assistance should be given the subsidy. And the same thing applies to school or healthcare. But it's like there shouldn't be any impact on this, because the higher income or the middle and higher income, some of them have sent their school to private schools, and then those are higher in fees. But as long as the fees are being charged are not higher than the private schools, and the same applies to the medical care. For those middle and higher income people should not be subject to paying the private hospital bills, that kind of rates. So if you are being reasonable and then they are supposed to be paying a higher rate than those people who are in need, then I think it's a fair arrangement. Again, it comes back to the system to say that, how do you impose it? How do you try to measure it? And then how do you say that you are paying 100 and this guy is paying 10? How do you? The system must be there to try to be fair to all parties concerned.
Yes. Of course, we are not seeing any RON 95 rationalization until middle of this year, I believe.
Yeah. So in actual fact, that will be an interesting
middle of
one.
next year, sorry.
Yeah. So the targeted subsidies over down here that's been put forth has a phased approach, to subsidy reforms and so on, and rationalization. Well, at least I would say that the government, since they are actually taking their time to look into this, this happened from the time the Baradi government was already in place, right? So they're taking their time. I would say that they're giving businesses the time to look into their costs and so on. Especially RON 95 was a little bit of, we were expecting it to be taken out immediately, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think at least they've given some time to look into it, probably 1st of May, was it?
I believe 1st of May, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Look into it.
So hopefully between now and then there'll be a bit more clarity, especially since we had the removal of the diesel subsidy earlier this year.
Right.
Hopefully we will see some lessons learned in at least the implementation of the diesel subsidy on RON 95.
Yeah, one must also look at Sarawak itself, because you can see by not removing the subsidy for the diesel part in Sarawak, then you have a lot more people getting ability to do business, and also getting access. Now, if you have just increased the cost of all of this in here, would it be the case that small businesses could not even move,
That's true.
They can't pay. And obviously, when you talk about SMEs, you are always talking about working capital, cash flows, all of this is things that's operating costs,
And then those people who are operating the sampans,
Yes.
We'll come back to this. We have a little bit more here to talk about, I believe. We need to go to another commercial. We'll be right back with more Budget 2025 after this. welcome back to Budget Watch 2025 live here on TVS. As we left it earlier, we were talking about petrol subsidy rationalization, trying to understand some lessons learned from earlier this year. I think something that we didn't necessarily talk about or cover was that it's a painful one to swallow, right? Petrol subsidy rationalization, but in a lot of ways, it's kind of an inevitability. What we need to look at is how we are going to manage the expectations of the rakyat and also alleviate the worst of the negative outcomes. Let's change tact a little bit and start talking about some green initiatives. So I think one of the things that we were looking for in the budget was issues around carbon tax, carbon taxation, ESG sort of initiatives. So perhaps now we can just sort of dive into this a little bit. One of the notes that I have here, the government will introduce a carbon tax on iron and steel as well as energy industries by 2026, aiming to encourage the use of low carbon technologies. The revenue from this tax will be used to fund research and green technology programs. Given that there's been a lot of attention and focus on energy transition in Malaysia, I believe the budget also included proposals for expansion of solar farms around the country. I believe there was also an expansion in Lake Kenya. So perhaps we can talk a little bit about some of the government's green initiatives and ESG thrusts. Mr. Desmond, if you would like to pick it up.
Generally, what I was expecting was that there was specific incentives or reliefs that's been given to SMEs for initiative on the guidance on ESG and training on ESG, because it is the case that the government is looking at how they can look at renewable energy, waste management. Sadly to say, it was not touched on extensive perspective. There seems to be some small sniff of the tax on allowances been given and so on, but it's not been fully talked about. But most important is when you come to SMEs in terms of ESG, they would like to understand how to implement such a thing for the company, because they will look at ESG funding, for example.
Sure.
So when you go to the banks, these SMEs, they've been asked this question. What are the policies that you've been implementing on ESG now? Some of them, they don't even know what ESG stands for.
Right.
It talks about environment, social and governance, but they seem to be taking ESG as a CSR activity. But obviously, the government should have more initiatives, or rather, budgets been given or grants been given on the understanding of ESG itself. But I think Sarawak has been doing very well on green, right?
Yeah, well, in regard to this ESG and also this green renewable energy and all these new high impact energy sector like hydrogen and all that, I mean, Malaysia has been talking about trying to promote this kind of or wanting to be in the forefront as well, particularly Sarawak. I think Sarawak has always been championing that kind of industry and that kind of sector. To a certain extent, I was, a little bit disappointed to see that there is no such major type of focus on the promotion of such a ESG. I mean, I was just thinking, if you really want to try to promote this kind of sector and this kind of industry, the government could have easily also allow double deduction on
some expenses
and all that, and help encourage the company to try to get to know. I mean, if I'm an SME, I say I can get double deduction. I would like to know what can I do, So if they do actually be a bit more proactive about that, I mean, it would have been better. I mean, more inclusive in that respect. I mean, I must admit that this was actually one of my wish lists.
Correct. And I also need to reiterate that ESG doesn't start with just businesses, right? It's also starting with the students and also looking at those, how do you nurture your kids, for example, on the area of ESG. Now, what are the initiatives parents should take, when you look into ESG? It starts from yourself, is it? Environment, and or in social and governance itself, it looks inside, it must be you, you know. And when you go and do business, that must be one of your policies in your business, you know.
Correct.
So generally, obviously, this has not been really emphasized on, you know. Yes, we are looking at, you know, looking at all these automations and so on, which is partially green, but some of it you have to actually look at into it. For example, when you implement data centers and so on, the ESG part of it needs to be looked at as well. But when it comes to that aspect of it, you know, when you look at small businesses, when you look at businesses looking into it, I think that's a major cost of doing business as well, you know. MNC companies, yes, they can really implement such a thing into their whole policies. They have a whole write-up and framework for all kinds, even gender equality and so on.
Correct.
But when you look at SMEs, they do not understand the aspect of this, and there is not, maybe there should be a watered-down framework specifically for SMEs. You know.
I think
Maybe I'd just like to add here, so that while there are many companies who may have their own type of definition of ESG, you know, but I think in Malaysia, if we want to try to do it, I mean, I'm sure Libak will probably also agree, if we are able to try to have that kind of funding or sponsorship of cultural event, you know, I mean, we would like to also propagate the kind of culture that we have. If we are able to try to do something like this, or any other social type of you know, initiative, that should be considered as part and parcel of the corporate society that you return to the to the rakyat lah, to the people, you know, and things like this should be allowable for tax deduction, you know.
I think kind of like at the risk of maybe we are sounding slightly more negative than we should be, some additional points that I wanted to just raise very quickly on some of the things that we've been talking about here. It does still feel that to quite a large extent, conversations around green initiatives, energy transition are pretty high level. It's not necessarily impacting at a lower level. Now, in my notes that I've been writing while you guys have been feeding me all this information, is perhaps we can consider this to as an aspect, perhaps a way of not adding additional cost on small businesses right now, considering all the things that we've covered earlier in the program. Perhaps not introducing any of these new requirements at a lower level is to sort of mitigate the worst of additional costs on businesses. I think the other thing is, it seems from this budget that there's a lot more investment perhaps in technological advancement. There have been initiatives regarding EV. There was a short segment dedicated to the fact that Perodua is introducing their EV next year, which will be priced under 100,000 ringgit, making it affordable to quite a mass market. Yeah, it does feel that perhaps we want to focus more on technological advancement as opposed to, say, for example, additional taxation. Bearing in mind that the government's decision to want to add a carbon tax is only going to happen in 2026 for iron and steel as well as energy industries. So, you know, perhaps there's a positive spin on all of this. On one hand, you know, yes, there's a lot more that can be done in terms of pushing for a green transition and a green agenda. Perhaps it's also sort of mitigate some of the expenses that we believe are going to be incurred from the budget.
Yeah, but Rashad, you must understand that you are talking about things that is only the MNC companies will do it, you know?
Yes.
What about, you know, nurturing the SMEs to understand it, you know? So you have things like this, but it is only you are trying to actually achieve, you know, probably you're asking those FDIs or you're asking foreign companies to come and knowledge transfer here.
Yeah.
But again, you know, the training, the guidance, you know, not to say that it's not been disseminated, okay? But what I'm saying is that it should be elevated even more. 90% of our economy is been driven by SMEs.
SMEs, exactly.
So I think that is something that you need to.
Would you consider this one of our key priorities, perhaps for SMEs?
Well, moving forward, I suppose that should be something that you're looking
you see, it's good to try to focus on all this new economy and new taxes, carbon tax, and all that sort of thing. But I think Malaysia is still lacking the kind of proper framework as to, you're talking about carbon footprint, you're talking about carbon credit, you're talking about all these carbon taxes. We do not know how do we do the exchange,
Yeah.
I mean, that is something always is lacking. Nobody seems to know, be able, what credit do I have? If I plant how many trees, how many credits do I have? Yeah. So I think these are the duty of the government to try to educate the industry. How do I get the credit, and whether I can sell the credit or to reduce my costs and all that, So I think these are areas of which, although it may not relate to the budget, but I think these are the areas of which the government should take more positive, proactive steps. But coming back to the SME, I think I do share Desmond's point of view. I think this budget, although it's inclusive, it is actually fairly rakyat-centric and all that. But taking into consideration of SMEs as a block, the contribution to the nation's economy, I think they are actually not being looked after in this particular budget, of which they form the backbone of the economy, And I think they should be given more attention. And if there is a need, they should be given more incentive to try to achieve what they want to achieve, like even automation, all this kind of thing should be given a certain incentive. And if you talk about experience before, during the time when the COVID-19 hit everybody, SME is the hardest hit.
Exactly.
Yeah. And they need the help, and of course the government helped. But here, when you talk about budget, I think if you want to try to move forward the economy and be the engine of growth, I think SME being the biggest block should be given the attention.
Yeah, exactly.
Perhaps let's talk about this a little bit, right? Let's talk a little bit about the attention that should be paid on SMEs, and perhaps also to an extension of that, perhaps the Malaysian middle class, as much of the driving force and the backbone of the economy. What sort of initiatives, what sort of things would you have liked to have seen, or would you hope to see in further elaborations of the budget in the weeks to come, Mr. Desmond, if you have any suggestions?
Yeah, if you look at it right now, I would say that the maturity of ESG, green technology, or rather the maturity of this aspect of it, all right, it is still on very far, even on the sustainable development goals on every company. Obviously, publicly listed companies, there is a requirement by SE to actually start doing something about it. But generally, what I would expect is that tax deductions or grants been given, or initiative by HRD Corp to train staffs, to look at the aspect of ESG, and also some of these agencies to, to come down, mooted by the government to come down to SMEs to give this particular training and guidance, and probably some form of framework. All right, maybe in the later part it can be disseminated, but some form of guidance. Come on, some SMEs. I'm not watering down the knowledge of SME players, but some of them might not even know what is net carbon or net zero. What is net zero? Or talking about carbon taxes, they don't understand what do you mean by carbon taxes. Correct. Like how Dato was mentioning, how do you calculate all of these things? Correct. So these are things that you don't have to go to that extent of technicality, but just the simple framework of what ESG is all about, and that should be encouraged by incentives, training, some form of guidance being given to the SMEs. I was looking forward to that, actually.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And just to add on to the kind of the question that you asked as to what are the things that the government can do to help SME. I mean, we have seen from Singapore, from Taiwan, all these places, the SME are being assisted by the government by saying that you want a minimum wage to go up, but they also would like to also say that to mitigate that kind of additional cost, they may want to automate, and if they want, the government should encourage that kind of automation, upgrade of your factory, or your manufacturing, or your processes and all that, and with that, the government can give you a grant or assistance for your automation. You just you come up with a kind of guideline that you can apply for what grant to your company. If you want to, if I can automate, I can reduce 3 or 4 of my staff or the manpower side. There may be savings, you know. I mean, I don't have to try to incur the problem of the minimum wage, you know. I mean, it keeps on going up, and then I will be able to automate, and then the government is encouraging that kind of improvement for the process of the company. And at the same time, just now as we mentioned, training, you know, the provision of further training to the staff so that you can increase your productivity and allow this kind of fees and all the charges that you incur to be tax deductible.
Correct.
Or even double deduction.
That's right.
As it is already, ESG has been looked like a CSR activity, you know. So CSR activity for most SMEs, I told you, it's mostly on the cost area.
Yeah.
So now it should be made aware to them that ESG is not a CSR activity, but it comes as a policy as how you want to do business.
Correct.
Now, how would you actually turn out policies in your business that you can save? Simple thing is to reduce the number of paper usage, you know. So these are things and part and parcel of your policy of doing implementing ESG in your company, is it? Yeah.
Excellent. Great insights there on a very tricky topic. We're going to take another short break and we'll be right back after this. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Budget Watch 2025. Let's talk a little bit now about social protection and welfare. So some quick things that the budget mentioned. Allocation for 10 billion for Rahmah cash contribution, which is an increase from 8 billion in 2023 to provide financial aid to low-income households. Additionally, we have things like home ownership campaign was extended to encourage home ownership. This also links back to something we mentioned earlier as far as tax rebate and incentive for first home ownership is concerned. Additionally, we are looking at an allocation of 58.1 billion for various social welfare initiatives, including subsidies, incentives, and assistance, with 50% of the allocation for controlling prices of goods and services. So there are a couple of things here that I want to quickly talk about. This is very much in keeping with our feeling that this is a very rakyat-centric budget. It's very individual-centric. Yes, we have talked a lot about how SMEs, in a way, there's a lot of burden, if you can say burden, that has to be borne by the SMEs, but it is a burden that is not without benefit. It is benefit and broad benefit, especially to Malaysians at large. Perhaps we can talk a little bit about some of the benefits of the cash aid programs that have been suggested or rather expanded upon, and then also the benefits of this initial home ownership campaign and home ownership rebates. So yeah, any initial thoughts, Mr. Desmond, about how this is going to help alleviate the cost of living for Malaysians, and so much so that we can also take advantage of our current economic climate moving forward into next year?
I would like to digress a little bit
Sure.
because what I've seen in this budget was the area of autism.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah, it's quite interesting where they help parents. You know, I understand I have lots of friends who have autistic children, or maybe slow learners. I would see that there is some what do you call that aid been given, right? Almost 15 million ringgit been given to parents, generally to look into. I mean, as in at programs for autism and so on. So, and also Pusat Perkhidmatan Autism, you know, to come up with some infrastructure for the autism community. So it's something that interesting to look at. Do you have anything to mention on pertaining to autism over down here?
Well, no, I think this is part and parcel of the social net, social welfare that is being given to the rakyat. But I think apart from autism, there are also many other kind of areas of which the government may be able to try to look into in future, like elderly care, and also, I mean, you can get into Alzheimer's and all that kind of different type of long-term care that is required, that the government can play a part, and then these are able to try to alleviate the kind of cost or even, kind of manpower. Sometimes it's very taxing to try to take care of the kind of
Correct.
So
long-term illness.
If I can quickly mention over here, it's the first time that any sort of allocation specific to autistic children in budget, which is amazing. And also to add on to that, 11 new Permata centers will be established to ensure each state has a dedicated facility for educating autistic children. Additionally, 2 new special needs schools with a budget in construction in Tuaran, Sabah and Johor Bahru with a budget of 300 million. So clearly there is a strong drive to make this budget as inclusive as possible. And personally, as a Malaysian, I think there's an element of pride here that we are introducing this element.
I think
into our
just
budget.
to add on further, there's also the pelepasan cukai,
Yes.
the relief
Yes.
on tax,
Yes.
which is now increased from 4,000 to 6,000.
Yes.
Yeah,
I
so
think
that's
that's
something good. Whereby there's an autistic community, there's a growing actually autistic community, which is something to not to say it's good.
perhaps a different conversation.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. So
Yeah, definitely. I think it's good to see a lot of attention paid in these areas.
Social illnesses.
correct. You know.
And to see that there is a significant investment in education in these areas as well. I mean, it's something that we talked about a little bit
Maybe
earlier.
mental health,
Yeah.
and all these things are also very taxing on the family.
Families.
Correct. Yeah.
So a lot of it really is about providing that infrastructural support to Malaysians during this particular time as we saw.
I'm actually
Yes.
quite excited to see whether there is actually aid being given to parents, because it is a very taxing time, as how you mentioned, to have such a child. You know, sometimes they do not know how to handle the child.
Exactly.
You know, so these are the community that you need to actually engage with, and see how they can be, given the knowledge, to handle such a situation, for these kids.
Absolutely. Okay, we
Regarding
are.
the,
Yes.
you're talking about the social, the cash handout. I think the government has actually increased this cash handout
Yes.
in this budget. I think it is actually also very important to have this cash handout continuation of the program because of the present high cost of living. But in effect, also it will also encourage spending, and which is actually good for the economy. So perhaps that is the consideration that the government has taken into account.
Multiple studies also show that cash transfer, non-conditional cash transfer in particular, is net benefit for recipients, definitely. Any additional thoughts perhaps on cash transfers and alleviating the cost of living? Do you think that the new introduction of the cash transfers, I believe there is now a significant increase. I can't pull the figure right now.
Was it 1,100 or something?
I think so. Do you feel that these new adjustments to the program will be beneficial for Malaysians in the short to medium term, in particular, looking through the next year?
I personally think that all this cash assistance would definitely be helpful to those who are in a lower income. But there are other countries have also, again comparing, other countries have experienced that some of these people who have received the cash, instead of using it to the right thing, they use it for the wrong things. You know? So they may be, if they feel that it is, maybe if they can fine tune it. Instead of that, you can give vouchers, you know.
More in kind.
No, you can exchange
Medical
for goods.
aid,
You can exchange for rice or anything like that in the supermarket with the participating in the companies, you know. But I mean, if it proves to be useful, carry on, you know. But if there is an abuse, maybe they can consider this kind of alternative.
Yeah, because this one is mostly directed to the B40, the lower rank. And I think it's also important that there be some education on how to use it prudently, because otherwise it comes to naught in the sense that
it don't serve the purpose.
May I disagree? Am I, as a moderator, am I allowed to disagree?
Are you a bachelor? There's nice education for bachelors.
No, I was just mulling over the fact of cash transfers in particular, and yes, a lot of it does come down to the delivery mechanism again, as we have talked a lot about. But also converse to some of the things that you mentioned earlier. Some studies also suggest that non-conditional cash transfers, meaning cash transfer without any conditions, feel free to spend it or whatever you want, is net benefit as opposed to net negative. People tend to spend their money on necessities more than on, if you will, vices. But again, this is one of those we can be here all night talking about this.
So maybe something we should look at the cost of living.
Yes.
And to contra off the inflation of the prices of goods and services, then maybe this would help. But then again, it is only serving the certain aspect of the B40.
Yes.
So it's not the whole riot itself, you know.
All right. I think with that, we are coming essentially to the end of our program now. Perhaps just to kind of recap some of the things that we've talked about, and maybe I will also invite your thoughts as well. So some of the things that we've covered, tax amendments essentially in terms of a progressive SST. I particularly like the example that the Prime Minister used of avocado and salmon. Personally, I'm not a big consumer of either, as they mostly are a little bit too expensive for my taste. So I think I escaped there quite comfortably. We've also talked about 2% tax on dividends. We have also covered sugar tax, or increase on the sugar excise. Also, we have, throughout our conversation here, talked about there isn't necessarily any new introduction of tax for higher income earners, but perhaps in the spirit of wealth redistribution, there is still a lot of different examples of distribution, whether in terms of subsidy rationalization for healthcare, for energy, anything here, feel free at any point just to jump in and add some additional thoughts. We also covered a conversation around development, particularly investments in Sarawak and what that means for the future of the states. Gentlemen,
minimum wage as well.
Minimum wage, how could I forget our very long conversation about minimum wage, yes. I feel like we could probably dedicate an entire segment just for that. But I think this is one of those things that will happily go back and forth between us quite a bit. Before we close, may I just invite everybody to give their final remarks, perhaps a little bit of a summary of some of our discussion, some key takeaways from both the budget as well as our discussion here tonight. So maybe I will go around the table, starting with Mr. Libat.
Yeah, as Dr. Richard was saying, this budget is actually rakyat-centric, and I think what is important is that the rakyat must benefit. But of course, when we talk about SME, it looks like they are being deprived of a lot of benefits this time. And I think it's also good to know that the states are also given allocation, and for Sarawak and Sabah, I think it's not that bad, and we will look in future on how our state Sarawak will prepare the budget and how these allocations are being used. So hopefully it will go back to the rakyat again.
Yes, definitely.
Especially in the rural areas.
Thank you. Mr. Desmond, please.
Yeah, Rashad, I think I'd like to reiterate what the PM have just mentioned. He just mentioned that it's a budget that's been given to the people and the people should use it wisely. All right. So although it is more to a people-centric budget or a caring budget, you could say, the budget also touches on the issue on housing, education, food, and also health, But then again, looking at all of this, how does businesses come into play, And this is where we would like to see a better understanding of how you would like to take the businesses forward, especially SME businesses forward in the upcoming 2025. I'd like to see that as to what is the ability of the government to push the businesses forward in the future.
Dr. Richard, finally.
Well, as I mentioned, that I think it has been a fairly balanced budget. But as we all know, in any budget, you will not be able to please everyone.
Yeah.
You will not be able to please every sector. But if we are able to cover the majority of it, although I would love the SME to be more focused in this one. Two things of which I find it a bit, it was my wish list that it did not happen, is that number one is the double deduction on the ESR or any promotion of ESG, ESG, and all the other CSR programs or cultural programs that they can assist to try to promote. The other thing is the SME focus is somewhat lacking to me. But I think to a certain extent, as a whole, the financial position of the entire budget, as what mentioned by the Prime Minister, they have shown slight improvement on the deficit of last year of 86 billion. And now they are projecting to have an 80 billion type of deficit. It is an improvement, although albeit slightly, But it is still a long way to go because the borrowing remains high at 1.5 trillion. I think, although I must say that we are moving slowly towards the right direction, hopefully we will be able to show some surplus one day, But with the allocation from the federal government, and which mentioned by Libat just now, the figure, I hope that it will have a positive impact to the Sarawak in their own budget, And with that kind of allocation and the kind of state-owned revenue, I think it will be a boost for our premier.
Thank you, everyone, for the robust discussion tonight. I have certainly enjoyed myself. It's been a pleasure and a novel experience. I'd like to quickly thank our panel here today, Mr. Libat Langgup, Secretary General of the Dayak Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Desmond Anil, National Council Member of SME Association, and Dr. Richard Wee, President of the Federation of Chinese Associations of Sarawak. Thank you for joining me tonight. It's been a pleasure being here. I'm Rashad Ali. This has been Budget Watch 2025 live on TVS. Thank you and good night.
Hey, very well done.